Nobody wins, everybody loses. That's what the governor said the other day when he announced cuts of nearly $500 million from the state budget for this fiscal year. The governor cut huge sums from local aid and from human services. The reductions, he said, will be devastating to people and to communities. In one of the most bitter days in memory at the State House, Dukakis complained about the legislature's unwillingness to raise the taxes Dukakis believes are necessary to pay for state programs. Amidst this turmoil, we're going to talk about the budget and taxes this morning with some people who are in the middle of it. Representative Richard Voke is from Chelsea. He is the chairman of the House Committee on Ways and Means, and he has been at the center of this storm since January. He has stood fast against taxes. Barbara Anderson is well known to our viewers. She is the executive director of Citizens for Limited Taxation, the godmother, if you will, of Proposition 2.5, and a staunch tax opponent. Peter Torigian is the president of the Massachusetts Municipal Association and the mayor of Peabody. He is very concerned about the local aid cuts by the governor. Jerry Williams needs no introduction to most of our audience. He is a talk show host on WRKO Radio, and Jerry, perhaps more than anyone else, has symbolized, along with Barbara, the opposition to the governor's position in this. Jim Braude is the head of the Tax Equity Alliance of Massachusetts and a person who is trying to get increased taxes to save some state services. Chairman Voke, let me start with you. The governor said nobody wins, everybody loses. Is he right?
Well, it's not a pleasant circumstance, there's no question about that. But the governor and the administration should have planned for this many months ago. We raised these issues in the House back in January and February. If you plan for them well ahead of time, you can negotiate them and have a softer kind of approach to these difficult times. Unfortunately, the administration waited till the last moment, and therefore the cuts are rather substantial.
Jerry Williams, the governor, the other day, quite rather pointedly in his budget reductions, talked about his disappointment that some of the debate here had been set by radio talk masters. There's no doubt in anyone's mind who he was referring to. His criticism is that you have shed more heat than light on this. What is your response to that?
My response is this morning's Boston Herald editorial cartoon, which says, Dookie Borden took an axe and gave the budget 40 whacks. And when he saw what he had done, he blamed the deed on everyone, including me and Howie Carr and anybody he could foist a barb at. Obviously, I'm a critic of the governor. I've been a critic of the governor for a long time. I don't think he's been a good governor. And I did it through popular times as well, not just unpopular times. The governor is politically paranoid. He is going through a political nervous breakdown, and he just simply wants to blame everything on everybody else.
We invited the governor to come, by the way, today, just so you know. He declined that invitation. Political nervous breakdown, what do you mean by that?
I think he's spending more time on inconsequential things. They're really not inconsequential. But I think he's spending more time on things like the MWRA vote. Paul Harold probably would tell you is more pressure than on anything budget-wise that he's ever done. He should be talking to Richie Voke, it seems to me. If Richie Voke has a no-tax budget, I'd like to know what it is. Why isn't the governor doing reform things like MDC abolishment, blended in out of the Senate budget? Why isn't he getting rid of hackdom in the county government? Why doesn't he get rid of county government?
Jerry, let's talk
entirely
about hackdom for just a second. Isn't hackdom a fair? Isn't that going the easy route? There's no line item, as they say, for waste and hacks in state government. Isn't that kind of a too easy term to use?
Well, it's not really a too easy term. Jim Braude will probably defend. He said, well, how many hacks are there? You know, one of those. That's what would you cut? Those are the arguments
you
get.
What would you cut, Jerry?
I just gave you two examples of things that one could cut, and Barbara will give you, I'm sure, some others.
Jerry, you know, let's
get back to the hacks.
Get it, if I may. Jerry,
let me get back to the
said
hacks.
For
you
months.
asked me the question about hacks.
Let's Jerry finish.
There are hacks everywhere. In every government agency, there are hacks. Hacks meaning they've been layered into state government since way back. I've been watching the state government since 1957. And a professor at Boston University said, if we could do a graduate study on this, we'd find that ex-reps, senators, relatives, friends, people with sponsors, I think if we just pinpointed Senator Bulger himself and see how many people he has placed, not only his relatives and friends, but placed and layered into state government, old reps and friends and senators, I venture to say it'd be between 4,000 and 5,000.
Chairman Voke, nobody in the state probably knows more about the state budget and its nuances than you. Is Jerry correct?
Well, I would disagree with actual numbers that you could balance the state budget by eliminating personnel alone. But I do agree with the end result of where Jerry gets in many cases, which is that you go through these budget items line item by line item. There are over 1,000 line items in the budget. We've increased spending 70% in 5 years when inflation is up 25%. You have to do what the House did. The House cut $600 million.
But is it because, as Jerry says, there are patronage people layered in everywhere?
Now, there's no one reason why the budget is in a particular problem that it is today. But it is something that you can work at. Salaries have gone up over double-digit for half-state employees last year alone. There have been increases in those areas, and you have to pare some of them back. You have to look to amalgamating government. You have to look to reducing from 13 secretariats down to 10 or 11. You have to reduce some of the agencies. But there are, no question, a lot of people are taking unfair hits in government simply because they're working hard in government. So there's sort of a middle ground between the two, I think.
Can I respond to a couple of these things, if I may? You know, Jerry, for months you've been saying, get rid of the legislative commissions. He did it. Cut your own payroll. He cut it. Let me just finish. Cut 18% of his own payroll. Get rid of the state cars. He's doing that also. Well, I'm sure you know the number of legislative officials who have relatives on the payroll. Do you know the number of teachers that lost their jobs? Do you know the number of AIDS patients who are not going to get treatment? You don't know those numbers because you don't want to talk about that. And with all due respect,
actually,
Chairman Voke, you said that the governor was late in responding, and I think to some degrees he was to the revenue numbers. But several months ago, you put out a budget that he said was balanced. You would agree that it's at least 250 out of balance. He would say it's up to $500 million out of balance. And the bottom line we find ourselves in is the year of the euphemism, I hope, came to an end. The governor's announcement. It's no longer downsizing, it's dismantling of government. And talking about the alleged sins of Mike Dukakis, talking about who responded too late, doesn't deal with the nightmare that this budget is going to visit on a whole spectrum of families in the state.
May I respond to that? What you have here basically is extremism. And Mr. Braude represents the extremism on the other side. He challenges the House budget. The House budget cut $600 million out without hurting anyone, I believe. Mr. Braude would have put $600 million in taxes in. Now Mr. Braude says we have $500 million more of cuts. Mr. Braude would put in $500 million more of taxes. The state is $800 million in debt. Mr. Braude would put $800 million of taxes in. Mr. Braude then, if you add it all up, has just come out for $1,900 million in taxes. If you raised all income taxes, corporate and personal, 20%. If you raised the sales tax 20%, you'd only raise $1,100 million. So here we are. There's no bottom line to the level of taxes that the people on the other side talk about. What has to happen is there has to be a middle ground between reducing some salaries that Jerry talks about, not as far as Jerry goes, but nearly not as far as Mr. Braude goes, because there's no limit to how much you'd have the people in that.
Peter, as a mayor, you have to manage these
People
things.
can fight over how much the taxes should be and shouldn't be. As far as cities and towns are concerned, they're taking a disproportionate share of this licking. Let's go back 3 times in 10 years. We dealt with a 4% cap. We dealt with Proposition 2.5. Now you're asking us to deal with the cut of $225 million of the $491 million. If Chairman Voke is right, that the budget is $250 million out of balance, cities and towns absorb 90% of the cut. If, in fact, the governor is right, counting those cuts that he's made that impact cities and towns like Gateway and Horace Mann grants and so forth, we absorb more than 50% of the cut. After we have cut our budgets and salary accounts back with 2.5 and a number of people work with us by 25 and 30%. And what I'm saying here, there's a credibility problem. No one believes anybody. See, in order for people to believe, and I agree with Chairman Voke, the legislature was sensitive to our local needs. They at least gave us a level-funded local aid package. What has happened here is that we are in a situation where we've been asked for the 3rd time, after we have cut our employees by 25 and 30%. In the city of Peabody, we have reduced our workforce by close to 30%, as Arlington has and many other communities, and people do not believe this.
Well, what's the solution?
Let me ask.
You want me to give you the answer?
We would all agree with the problem.
Well, let me give you the answer. You asked me, and I've done it 3 times in the city of Peabody. The answer is that you have to go line by line and start making some cuts and telling people we can't have a government as big as it is. In the city of Peabody, back when Proposition 2.5 hit, we had the demonstrations. We closed the schools. We also cut back on various projects, Council on Youth Needs. Some very distasteful things were done. Can you tell me what has been done that has created the stir throughout the Commonwealth, or the woman pushing the baby carriage saying, my husband just lost her job? What has been done? People don't believe us.
Barbara Anderson, how do you respond to that?
To which? See how ladylike and laid back I'm being today?
To Peter's notion that that they've been taking the hits. The mayors, the municipal level, who hire the police, who have to fire the police and fire the teachers, are taking all the hits.
We agree with Mayor Torigian, and I'm sure with Chairman Voke, and with Jerry for that matter, we're going to have to override the local aid.
What a diplomat, agreeing with everyone here.
On the local aid issue, we're certainly going to have that override, and Citizens for Limited Taxation is supporting that.
But not fund it once they override it. Isn't that right, Barbara?
To get back to Jim's point on the governor is finally I'm talking to Charlie right now, please. Do you mind? On the governor finally doing some things like getting rid of some of the state cars, none of that would have happened if Jim had had his way and they had simply increased the budget by another $1 billion, as Chairman Voke says, and if Richie had not gone in there and fought to cut it back, all that spending would have taken place. We still wouldn't have had any money. There'd be an even bigger tax increase, and those cuts would never happen because of his resistance to new taxes for fiscal 90 at least, and our resistance for 89 as well. Sooner or later, they're going to get rid of all the things that we file under the category of waste, or they aren't going to have the money for programs. And the people who want the programs, like Peter Torigian, are going to fight back. So I really have a sign of hope here. I think we're really moving in the right direction.
I want to talk about some of those programs, but we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come right back. We are back talking about the state budget and taxes in Massachusetts. Jerry Williams, Peter, I think, said no one believes anyone. How bad is the credibility of the state government today based on what you hear?
Well, the governor doesn't impress anybody. I mean, he doesn't convince anybody. He's not the world's greatest convincer. As he had tried the other day to make it out, it was Howie Carr's fault, it was my fault, it was everybody's fault but his. And it doesn't want Barbara's fault. He called her tax cutter, which is a good word for Barbara, I think. I think that's a compliment, as a matter of fact.
Probably one of the nicest things he's ever done.
And then when you read the budget, when you read Paul Tsongas's remarks, Paul Tsongas obviously has incurred the wrath and ire, and so has Richie Voke. I bet you Richie's not in good shape with
that was quite remarkable what
the
Tsongas said, a Dukakis appointee, former senator, who comes out and says that there is no confidence here in the state government. We have to have business leaders come in and take over. Weren't you surprised by that, Richie?
Yes, very much so. Paul Tsongas was just appointed the head of the Board of Regents by the governor. They're very close. He campaigned for the governor. I was really very surprised at the frankness of his remarks.
I wasn't surprised at all, because I've been expecting this from Paul Tsongas, just as I expected Richie Voke to do what he did this year. There is leadership in this state before everybody panics and thinks there's nothing going on here. The governor is standing in the way of that leadership. There's nothing we can do about that, apparently, for a year and a half, but there are people here who are willing to take the lead, and I think and Peter Torigian's another one, and I think we're going to come out of this. It's just going to be a very difficult year.
And let me talk about that retrospective. Don't you think we have a right to go back and see what the governor did during his campaign a year ago? I mean, don't you think we have a right to do that when the legislature would not come back into session, not meet their obligations? We have to go back to take a look at what the governor did to bring us to the point where we're about to have the largest increase in taxes in the history of the Commonwealth.
But, Jerry, all you want to do is look back. You don't want to look forward.
Yes,
Talk about
do.
one topic. Can you focus just on education? Just for 1 minute. There were close to 4,000 or 5,000 teachers losing their jobs before the vetoes. Another 3,000 as a result of the vetoes. Thousands of scholarships for higher education not going to happen. What's your answer to that? Blame Dukakis for his presidential campaign?
People should know
that,
that Jim Braude represents all the tax receivers. That was what he is.
Don't talk about the issues, Jerry.
He's a legislative agent. Some people don't know that.
That's kind of relevant.
Why don't you
He
answer
is a
the question?
legislative agent for the tax receivers.
Fair enough.
That's right. And the
given that
taxpayer,
background,
talk about education. Here's the Cape newspaper this past week. College salaries exceed 90,000. This is at the Mass Maritime Academy.
How about the kids who aren't going to get into the higher education system?
Let the governor do this.
Why don't you talk about what's going to happen tomorrow instead of what happened last November? You don't want to talk about it because you don't want to talk about services. Next week, when the legislature, I think in good faith, attempts to override the local aid vetoes, you'll be on the airwaves saying, go get them, boys and girls. And you know what? You're never once going to talk about money to fund that override. It's a symbolic stop for cities and towns.
Who's going to do the firing? It will not be the governor. It'll be the mayors and managers in every city and town in Massachusetts, as it was with the 4% cap, as it was with Proposition 2.5. We have been the heavies in this process for the last 10 years. And all I'm suggesting is, and I'm not criticizing the budget because I may not know enough about the state budget, but someone ought to scrutinize it, take what they can out of it, make some tough decisions. Tell me the tough decisions that have been made at the state level.
Do you think tough decisions were not made last week?
They were passed down. The chaos was shifted from Beacon Hill to local city government. That's what happened.
I agree, and the solution is being honest with the voters.
The solution is going to be made by us.
As Chairman Voke said, extremism on either side is not the solution. a compassionate middle that honestly said to the voters, we need more money to make sure education stays afloat. We don't see AIDS, the spread of AIDS outstripping the spending by 7 to 1. The reality is we're here today.
Jim,
we're not 7 months
last
ago.
year by $1 billion. If you now look at all the supplemental budgets, the one they just passed with the tax increase.
The state's needs being met, Barbara, and you want to take $1 billion more away.
How much of our money do you want of our money before they need everything?
I want services
that
for
your
families in
members
the state.
consider
You know what
How
happened
much of our money do you want before your members are
very negative
satisfied?
tone. This year, fees and fines of $360 million, is that it? Fees and fines. If the governor had not indulged in that nitpicking, picking people's pockets, people would have been a lot happier with the governor. But they picked at him. They stopped them on the road for $180 tickets and whatever. Everybody knew it was a tax, not a fee. Even the governor during his campaign said to Richie Gebhardt that the oil import fee was not a fee, it's a tax. Mm-hmm. So all of that nitpicking, all of that pecking away at people brought the governor down to where his popularity is nil. What he should have done, and what he could have done if he had some decent advice, is come in with one tax, one package, and said, here's what we got to do. We've got this problem.
If he had come in, Jerry, do you and said, look, we've got some very difficult times. Our revenue projections were wrong as they were in New York and Connecticut and some other states. We've got some difficult problems, basically fessed up to at least that part of it. We've got to have some new revenue. Do you think people would have supported
that? It would have
that?
been a much easier job to put forward one tax and one idea or one thought, rather than getting people with all those fees, all those fines. I mean, and then to come forward in his axe cutting this past week and say, I'm going to cut $3 million out of the registry funds, and we're going to close 13 registry offices. That is a pure, unadulterated lie.
Mayor, in all of this with the cuts, who gets hurt? Because you're at the local level, you have to make those decisions.
I think Jim has touched on some of it. You're going to see that there'll be some cutback services for education, council on youth needs, senior citizen programs, and various programs. What you have to understand, Jim, in government, at the local level, with all due respect to the chairman of House Ways and Means, Rich Voke, is that when you turn the tap and the water doesn't come up, they don't call the governor, they call us. And when the streets are not plowed, they call us. And when the kids are not getting special needs, they call us.
Understood.
Okay, we deliver it. And what you're doing to us for the third time in 10 years is asking us to make the tough choices for the state level.
So exactly what happens, Mayor? Who gets hurt? What services will you lose, do you think?
Jim touched on education. All services will be impacted locally. When you take $225 million out of the local treasuries, you're going to hurt all types of services.
Isn't this a key question?
That's a decision of the mayor
Chairman, can I ask you one question?
Certainly.
Can you balance this budget without any new taxes?
For FY 90, yes, if we had it back at this point.
You could do it?
Yes. Yes, we could just do it, I think, without hurting essential services.
Right, and could you give the money back to the cities and towns that they need?
Yes, what we see as the problem is the following. When the governor submitted his budget in January, he wanted $600 million taxes. We gave him $600 million of cuts. We relied upon what he was telling us the numbers were in the entitlement programs and Medicaid and so forth. Those numbers have proved to be incorrect, creating greater deficiencies since they're required programs to poor people who need services, and you have to cut that amount of dollars in other places.
But I mean, if the governor called you in, you could say, here's what we can do.
We could do 250. We believe it's 250.
It
He's
is
saying
not
it's
the talk
491.
show host, it is not the columnist, it is you. It is you. You are the problem.
Well, I don't like to personalize it, obviously.
But he does.
We have a very different, I know I'm not their favorite on their dance card any longer, but to say the least.
Shall we dance?
But it's just because we have a different philosophy of government. I mean, I think it can be done. I think you can cut back some of the waste. 70% growth in that period of time is an awful lot. Cities and towns, we in the House level funded cities and towns in January, shocking a lot of people. But while we went up 70% in spending, direct state local aid went up 92%. They adjusted to that, and they joined with us,
Yeah,
and now
don't you
it's
think
fair.
the governor's strategy is really to get all the tax receivers,
Jerry, I want to give Jim
and
Braude.
the taxpayers to be angry?
I
at
want
you
to give Jim a chance to respond to what you just said, but we're going to take a quick break first, Jim. Come right back. We are back talking about the state budget and taxes. Jim Braude.
Just a couple of things. You know, people's heads spin, understandably, when they hear percentages and numbers. And the chairman has mentioned twice that state spending has gone up 70% in the 80s. He's right. But as you also know, that's a lower increase in spending than any other state in New England, with the exception of Rhode Island. So everything has to be put in perspective. Secondly, Jerry, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago these horrible fees. I think everyone would agree they were a nightmare politically. If we repealed them tomorrow, if we could urge people like Chairman Voke and others to repeal them, would you agree to some fair, equitable tax to replace them?
As Chairman Voke will tell you,
we need the money. That's what funds services in the state.
I understand. You need the money. I don't need anything,
Jerry.
I'm willing to come up with a fair share of my income or on sales taxes to bail out the state if it's necessary, even though we're bailing it out at the behest of the governor's campaign. The governor is the leader. I'm just a follower. And I'm telling you that people are angry at him. They're angry because this is one of the hardest states to live in. We have income taxes that are going to be number one, sales taxes that are fairly high.
We have all sorts of... Actually, see, there you go again. Sales taxes, in
5%.
fact, sales taxes, the burden on families is in the lowest 10 states in the United States. But you don't care if the facts stand in the way.
Do we have to be number one?
No, we truly don't have to be number one.
Barbara, where's our overall tax burden?
It's per capita, it's the fifth highest in the country if you're doing state and local taxes. But Jim's argument that there's no money, there is $12 billion. Last year, Richie Voke's budget went up $500 million, and he was getting in all kinds of trouble for only increasing $500 million. The governor is cutting, if they do the veto, $250, $300 million. We're talking essentially level funding with last year's level of services, and that was not a disaster.
Just not true, Barbara. You know it's not true.
Don't tell me what I know, Jim.
What do you say to the teachers that are being laid off? What do you say to the kids not getting into schools? What do you say to the AIDS patients?
Last year you had AIDS programs. Last year you had teachers in education. Last year we were tooling along just fine. We were a miracle, as a matter of fact, if I remember the governor's speech. So all of a sudden it's disaster and devastation and destruction because we're going back to last year's level of funding.
How did we get to this point? A year ago we were hearing from the governor in Atlanta at his nomination speech that we had one of the most successful states in the United States of America. We had a robust economy. Our state government fiscally was in terrific condition. And here we are today. We can't agree on anything except that the problem is very serious. How did we get to this point?
I'll try. I'll give you what may appear to be a simplistic answer. I think when you have growth as we had and you build it into the base of your budget, you need that same kind of growth to sustain it. And that growth is not there anymore. The wise cities and towns, what they did during that period of growth, is took it and put it into capital projects, one-time expenditures, or into some sort of stabilization fund to deal with the inevitable. And the inevitable is reached here. You can't build your base and expect to feed it when your growth winds down from 12 to 6%.
Actually, the problem was the governor's campaign for president. That's what the problem was. Everybody's playing the power. The legislature opted out. They didn't want to do anything. They played the power. It looked like in July he was going to be the next president of the United States. And we all opted out. The Globe, excuse me, Charlie, and people who wrote books about the governor opted out. They, as I said, all these kind things about him. The national media opted out. They didn't want to really know what the governor was all about, who he was, what his character traits were all about. They opted out, and the legislature played the power, and all of a sudden,
can I put a good word in for the governor?
That was the end of it.
You sure can.
His race is certainly not the cause of the problems. It may have exacerbated it, but it wasn't the cause. Plus the fact when the situation was brought up that the legislature should have come back into session and didn't because the governor was running for president. The reason people wanted us to come back into session was to spend more money to override many of the vetoes that he did make.
So it would have
made, they may have wanted the money to go in those places, but it was where he went to cut spending. Every veto he had was to lower the level of spending.
We didn't want him to come back in to get more money so much as to take back their authority that the governor was taking over. The problem we have right now is they have no power left. He's spending whatever he wants to spend. He's doing whatever he wants to do. They lost that authority last year when they let him have it, and that's one of the reasons we're in this situation.
Well, let me comment on that if I could.
Yeah, they let him take that fee power.
You know what we're going to have to do? We're going to have to continue this at some other time, maybe next week or the week after, because we're out of time. Thank you all.
Outside,
all right, thank you all very much for coming, and we appreciate it. We're going to come back in just a second to check in live at the Bay State game. Stick around.